Walter Langford had exactly 4 minutes left to live on an operating table in Dallas, Texas, and the only reason he is alive right now, breathing, blinking, sitting in a courtroom in a suit worth more than most people's cars, is a woman he just destroyed in front of a judge and called a liar to her face. 3 years ago, she gave him a piece of her own body and asked for nothing in return. Last week, he took away her career, her savings, and her name in the city, and he smiled doing it. He has no idea. He has absolutely no idea that the woman sobbing outside that courthouse right now is the reason his heart is still beating at all. And in the next few minutes, you are going to watch the moment he finds out. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 years before that verdict, Walter Langford would have died in a hospital bed in Dallas, Texas, if not for a stranger he never bothered to meet, a stranger whose blood type matched his by pure chance, a stranger who said yes without asking a single question about who he was or what he was worth. That stranger was Renata Coslow. And now this court, the same justice system Walter had used his fortune to bend and shape for over a decade, had just handed him a victory that would leave her broke, humiliated, and unable to work in her own industry ever again. The questions that matter now are simple, but they will not have simple answers. Why did a billionaire need to crush a woman who had never once asked him for anything? What was it about Renata Coslow specifically that made Walter Langford decide she was the one who needed to be made an example of, out of dozens of employees who could have made the same mistake? And what happens, what really happens, when the truth about who saved his life finally catches up to him, in a city where everyone already believes they know exactly who Walter Langford is? To understand any of that, you need to go back further than the courtroom, further than the lawsuit, further even than the surgery that connected these two lives in a way neither of them saw coming. You need to understand who Walter Langford was before he became the man capable of doing what he did, and who Renata Coslow was before she became the woman strong enough to survive it. Walter Langford grew up in a house that smelled like diesel and ambition, the son of a man named Earl Langford who built a freight company out of 3 second-hand trucks and a line of credit he barely qualified for. Earl worked nights for years, drove half his own routes himself, and raised his only son on the belief that weakness was simply a choice people made when they did not want success badly enough. Walter absorbed that lesson early and never let go of it. By the time he was 26, he had taken over daily operations from his aging father. By 35, he had grown Langford Freight Solutions from a regional trucking outfit into one of the largest privately held logistics companies in the American Southwest, with warehouses stretching from Dallas to Phoenix and a personal fortune that put him on lists he never publicly acknowledged reading. Success for Walter had never felt like luck. It felt like proof. Proof that his father's philosophy had been correct all along, that the world rewarded people who refused to bend, who treated every obstacle as something to be dismantled rather than negotiated with. He surrounded himself with people who reflected that same hardness back at him, board members who respected results over relationships, attorneys who billed by the hour and never asked uncomfortable questions about the methods behind a win. Somewhere in that climb, Walter had stopped seeing the people 3 and 4 levels below him as people at all. They were functions. Dispatchers, drivers, warehouse managers, all interchangeable parts in a machine he had built to run without sentiment. Because sentiment, in Walter's mind, was the first crack that let inefficiency in. Renata Coslow's life had moved in almost the opposite direction, shaped not by inheritance but by the steady, unglamorous work of simply holding things together. She had grown up in Fort Worth, the older of 2 daughters, and had learned early how to manage a household on very little, watching her own mother stretch a single paycheck across rent, groceries, and 2 girls who never went without even when there should not have been enough to go around. Renata carried that same quiet competence into her own adult life. She married young, had Caleb at 26, and watched the marriage quietly dissolve 4 years later when her husband decided fatherhood asked more of him than he was willing to give. She did not fall apart. She found a job at Langford Freight Solutions through a cousin who worked in the warehouse, learned the dispatch software faster than anyone training her expected, and built a career out of being the person everyone on her floor could rely on when something went wrong. By the time this story truly begins, Renata had spent 8 years in that dispatch office, 8 years of clocking in early, memorizing the quirks of a routing system that was older than some of her coworkers, and raising a son who was now 14, all elbows and quiet opinions, growing into the kind of teenager who noticed far more than he said out loud. She kept a photo of Caleb on her desk, one from a baseball game 2 summers earlier, his face caught mid-laugh, and she looked at it more than she ever would have admitted to anyone walking past her desk. Her coworkers liked her. They brought their problems to her, not because she had any official authority, but because she listened in a way most people on that floor had stopped expecting from each other. Walter Langford, 3 floors above her, in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a fleet of trucks bearing his family's name, did not know she existed. That distance between them, between the man at the top and the woman who kept his company functioning from the inside, was exactly the kind of gap Walter had spent his whole career building on purpose. He believed in hierarchy the way some men believe in scripture. The people below him did not need to be known. They needed to be efficient. And for years, that arrangement worked exactly the way Walter intended it to, until a routine email about a blood drive partnership quietly slipped past that hierarchy and changed both of their lives without either of them noticing it happening. It arrived in November, sent from the company's internal wellness account to every employee on the Langford Freight Solutions email directory, the kind of mass message most people deleted within seconds of opening. The subject line read simply, "Partner Blood Drive, Dallas Memorial Health Network." Renata almost deleted it too. She was 3 days behind on a shipment audit, juggling a parent-teacher conference for Caleb that same week, and a blood drive flyer was about as far from urgent as anything in her inbox. But something made her open it anyway, maybe boredom, maybe the kind of small mercy that sometimes nudges a person toward a decision that will eventually change everything. Buried in the third paragraph, past the standard language about donation eligibility and appointment scheduling, was a single line requesting volunteers with a specific, rare blood type for an expanded donor compatibility screening, tied to what the email vaguely described as a confidential transplant case involving a patient in critical need. No name, no department. Just a request, sponsored, oddly enough, by Langford Freight Solutions itself, a detail that struck Renata as strange enough to read twice before she shrugged it off as some corporate goodwill initiative meant to look good in a press release. She filled out the screening form on her lunch break between bites of a sandwich she barely tasted, checked the box confirming her blood type, and went back to her shipment audit without giving it another thought for the rest of the day. The call came 11 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, while Renata was elbow-deep in a routing dispute between 2 regional warehouses. The woman on the other end identified herself as a transplant coordinator from Dallas Memorial, and there was something in her voice, an excitement she was clearly trying to keep professional, that made Renata step away from her desk to take the call somewhere quieter. The coordinator explained, carefully, that Renata's screening results had come back not just compatible, but exceptionally so, the kind of tissue and blood match that transplant teams sometimes waited years to find for a single patient. The patient in question, the coordinator explained, was in advanced kidney failure, deteriorating faster than doctors had initially projected, and had been searching for a viable living donor for months without success. Renata asked, the way almost anyone would, who the patient was. The coordinator explained, gently but firmly, that hospital policy and federal privacy law prevented her from disclosing that information unless both parties agreed to a mutual release, something that occasionally happened after surgery but was never guaranteed and never required. Renata sat with that for a moment, turning the secrecy over in her mind, and then made the same decision she had made about most things in her life without overthinking it. She told the coordinator it did not matter to her who the recipient was. She had a blood type, the recipient needed it, and somewhere out there was a family who might get more time with someone they loved. That was enough reason for her. She scheduled her pre-surgical evaluation for the following week and drove home that night without telling anyone except her sister, who cried on the phone and called her either the bravest or the most reckless woman she had ever known, depending on the hour Renata caught her. What Renata could not have known, what the entire structure of hospital privacy law was specifically designed to prevent her from knowing, was that the man dying slowly in a private wing on the 9th floor of that same hospital was Walter Langford. He had been diagnosed nearly 14 months earlier, after a routine physical flagged abnormal kidney function that his personal physician initially dismissed as stress-related. Follow-up testing told a different story. Walter's kidneys were failing, gradually but unmistakably, the result of a genetic condition that had likely been quietly progressing for years before any symptom forced its way to the surface. He told almost no one. Not his board, not most of his extended family, not even his closest business partners, men he had known for over 20 years. In Walter's mind, illness was not simply a private matter. It was a liability, a weakness that competitors and investors would seize on the moment word got out, and he was not about to hand anyone that kind of advantage over a body that was, in every other sense, still winning. He hired a private medical concierge firm to manage his case quietly, the same kind of discreet, expensive infrastructure wealthy men use to keep their lives from intersecting with anything resembling vulnerability. That firm worked behind the scenes with Dallas Memorial to expand the donor search beyond the standard registry, using sponsored drives at major local employers, including through a chain of corporate sponsorship arrangements that Walter personally approved without reading the fine print, his own company. He never imagined the donor pool would include people who worked 3 floors beneath his office. He never imagined it would include anyone he might actually know. To Walter, the entire search was an abstraction, a logistics problem not unlike the freight routes his company managed every day, inputs and outputs, supply meeting demand, with no particular face attached to either side of the equation. The surgery took place on a cold morning in mid-December, in adjoining operating rooms on the same floor of the same hospital, separated by a single hallway neither Walter nor Renata would ever walk down together that day. Renata went under anesthesia not knowing whose body would receive what she was giving away. Walter was wheeled in roughly 90 minutes later, prepped and sedated, trusting a system he had paid enormous amounts of money to manage on his behalf, never once asking the kind of question that might have connected the two of them before either surgeon made the first incision. Both procedures went smoothly. Renata woke up groggy and sore, but stable, the kind of ache that told her something significant had happened inside her, without yet telling her exactly what it would mean for her recovery. Walter woke up hours later to a transplant team explaining that the new kidney had taken immediately, that his numbers already looked dramatically improved, that barring complications, he could reasonably expect decades of normal function ahead of him. He asked one question before drifting back to sleep, the only question he ever bothered to ask about the person who had made that recovery possible. He asked whether the donor was healthy. The nurse told him yes, recovering well, expected to be discharged within a few days. Walter nodded, satisfied, and never asked anything else. In his mind, the matter was a closed transaction, the same as any other service his money had purchased, and he drifted into the kind of relieved, dreamless sleep that comes only after a person believes, wrongly or rightly, that the worst is finally behind them. Renata went back to work 6 weeks later, lighter in her bank account from unpaid medical leave, but carrying something else entirely in her chest. A quiet, private satisfaction she never quite found the words to explain, not even to her own sister. She did not tell her coworkers what she had done. She did not post about it, did not look for recognition, did not even mention it to Caleb beyond telling him she had undergone a minor procedure that required a few weeks of rest. She simply returned to her desk, to her headset, to the same quiet rhythm of dispatching trucks and managing routes that had defined her working life for nearly a decade, never once suspecting that the man whose name was painted across every truck she routed was now carrying a piece of her inside his own body. Life for both of them continued on its separate, parallel track for almost 2 years. Renata kept working, kept raising Caleb, kept being the steady, reliable presence her coworkers had always known her to be. The lawsuit and everything that came with it still entirely unimaginable to her at that point. Walter, meanwhile, threw himself back into expansion with the renewed intensity of a man who had been given, in his own words to one board member, a second chance he did not intend to waste. He closed deals faster, pushed harder, and began chasing a contract that would define the next chapter of his company's growth, a massive distribution agreement with one of the largest retail chains in the country, the kind of deal that could push Langford Freight Solutions past $1 billion in annual revenue for the first time in its history. That contract, and Walter's obsession with protecting it at any cost, is what eventually pulled Renata Coslow's name back into his orbit, though not in any way either of them could have imagined sitting in those separate operating rooms 2 years earlier. The retail chain's leadership had made their expectations brutally clear from the start. No delays, no missed shipments, nothing that would embarrass a brand whose national advertising campaigns depended on precise, predictable delivery windows. Walter promised them flawless execution personally, in a boardroom meeting he later described to his executive team as the most important handshake of his career. And that promise rolled downhill exactly, the way pressure always did inside Langford Freight Solutions, landing hardest on the dispatch floor, where Renata and a handful of coordinators were now responsible for routing triple the normal shipment volume through software that had not been meaningfully updated in close to a decade. The error, when it finally happened, was almost absurdly small. A single shipment, miscoded to a distribution center in Oklahoma instead of its intended destination in Arkansas, the kind of routing slip that occurred a dozen times a year under ordinary circumstances, and was corrected without ceremony, without blame, without anyone losing more than a few hours of sleep over it. Under ordinary circumstances. This particular truck carried time-sensitive product tied directly to the retail chain's new national launch, merchandise that needed to hit store shelves on a specific date, already locked into a television, advertising rollout costing millions of dollars. The misroute delayed delivery by 11 hours. 11 hours, against a deadline that had no flexibility built into it at all. The retail chain's executives called Walter directly within hours of discovering the delay, furious, threatening to revisit the entire contract, hinting at penalty clauses buried deep in the agreement that could cost Langford Freight Solutions tens of millions of dollars if this became a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Walter took that call standing in his office, looking out over the same fleet of trucks his father had once driven himself, and felt something he had not felt in years, the unfamiliar, unwelcome sensation of his own control slipping. He needed this handled. He needed it handled visibly, decisively, in a way that would prove to that boardroom, and to his own board, that nothing like this could ever happen again. An internal investigation traced the miscoded shipment back to Renata's terminal within 2 days. What that investigation conveniently failed to highlight, buried several pages into a report few executives actually read in full, was that the exact same routing field had been flagged as defective in 2 separate incident reports filed months earlier. reports that management had reviewed and ultimately decided were not urgent enough to warrant the cost of a system overhaul. Renata had filed one of those reports herself. She raised it again, calmly, the moment HR called her in, laying both old reports on the table as proof that the error belonged to a system everyone had known was broken, not to any carelessness on her part. She was told, politely but firmly, that the matter was being handled at a level above her pay grade. She did not yet understand what that phrase actually meant. She would understand within the week, standing in her own doorway with Caleb watching from the kitchen, holding a legal filing that named her personally, alleging gross negligence, and seeking damages that exceeded anything she could repay across several lifetimes of retail shifts and overtime combined. What Renata did not know, could not have known, was that this lawsuit had not emerged from any standard legal process grinding forward on its own momentum. 3 days after that furious phone call from the retail chain, Walter Langford had personally pulled her file from the dozens of routine matters that normally never reached his desk. He read her name for the first time in 8 years of her working underneath him, scanned the basic facts of the incident, and made a decision that had far less to do with one misrouted truck than it did with everything else weighing on him that month. He needed his board to see him as untouchable. He needed the retail chain to see consequences swift and severe enough to guarantee this never happened again. And he needed, more than either of those things, to silence the quiet doubts he had started hearing from certain board members about whether Walter Langford still had the same iron grip on his own company that had built it in the first place. Renata was not the cause of any of that. She was simply convenient, replaceable, and small enough in Walter's eyes that crushing her in public would cost him nothing and prove everything he needed proven. He initialed the filing himself, instructed his lead attorney to make absolutely certain the case received visibility, internally and in the local business press, and walked into his next meeting without sparing her another thought, the same way he had not spared a thought for the donor who once saved his life beyond a single question about her health. The case moved through the court system faster than anyone outside Walter's legal team expected, a deliberate strategy his attorneys had recommended from the start. A slow, drawn-out trial invited scrutiny, leaks, sympathetic profiles of the woman being sued by a billionaire. A fast, decisive case looked clean. It looked like accountability. Renata could not afford private representation against a firm that billed thousands of dollars an hour for partners who had not personally argued a case in years, and the overworked public defender, eventually assigned to assist her, was juggling nearly 40 other cases that same month, with barely enough hours in any given week to read her file in full before each hearing. She walked into that courtroom on the first day of trial with a thin folder of printed incident reports, a borrowed blazer that no longer fit quite right after months of stress eating away at her appetite, and very little else standing between her and financial ruin. Walter's lead attorney, a sharp, unhurried man named Gerald Voss, had built a reputation over 2 decades for winning cases not on the strength of facts but on the strength of narrative, and he constructed Renata's narrative with surgical precision. He did not dwell on the routing glitch itself, which he privately understood was the case's most vulnerable point. Instead, he built an entire opening statement around Renata's character, painting her as an employee who had grown complacent after years of comfortable tenure, someone who treated documented system warnings as optional rather than urgent, someone whose negligence had nearly cost a great American company a contract that supported hundreds of jobs across 3 states. He used words like complacent and careless so often in his opening statement that jurors who had never met Renata Coslow before that morning began nodding along before she had said a single word in her own defense. When Renata's 2 incident reports finally came up on the second day of trial, the same reports proving management had known about the routing field's defect for months before her error occurred, Voss dismissed them within seconds, his tone almost bored, as though the documents barely deserved the court's attention. He argued that any competent dispatcher, faced with a known software defect, bore a personal responsibility to escalate that concern repeatedly and aggressively until it was fixed, regardless of what it had or had not addressed on their end. He suggested, without ever quite saying it outright, that Renata's failure to escalate loudly enough was itself a form of negligence, shifting the entire weight of a systemic failure onto one woman's shoulders through nothing but careful phrasing and a confident delivery. Renata took the stand on the afternoon of the second day. She had rehearsed her testimony the night before, sitting at her kitchen table after Caleb had gone to bed, trying to find calm, clear language for something that felt, every time she tried to explain it out loud, far more complicated than it actually was. None of that preparation survived contact with Gerald Voss's cross-examination. Her hands shook visibly around the edges of the witness box. She tried to walk the jury through the timeline, the prior incident reports, the volume increase nobody on the dispatch floor had been properly staffed to handle. But Voss interrupted her rhythm again and again, cutting precisely formed questions into her answers before she could finish a single complete thought, twisting her own careful wording back at her, until simple sentences began collapsing under the weight of his repetition. By the time he finally sat down, the courtroom no longer saw a woman caught inside a broken system that management had ignored for months. They saw exactly what Walter Langford had paid an enormous amount of money to construct, a careless employee who had cost a great company everything it had worked to build, someone who deserved whatever consequence the court decided to hand down. Walter sat through every minute of it without once speaking, watching from the defense table in a navy suit that cost more than most people in that courtroom made in a year, his expression giving away nothing. He did not look at Renata when her voice cracked on the stand. He did not look away from her either. He simply watched, the way a man watches a problem being efficiently solved on his behalf, the same detached attention he gave quarterly earnings reports or freight route optimizations, as though the woman trembling 20 feet away from him were nothing more than another line item finally being resolved. The judge took less than 2 hours to rule in Langford Freight Solutions' favor, ordering damages that would strip away Renata's modest savings account entirely, force the sale of her car, and place a lien dangerously close to the small rental house she shared with Caleb. The retail chain's executives, seated quietly in the gallery, exchanged satisfied glances. The message had been sent exactly as intended. Negligence at Langford Freight Solutions, regardless of who was ultimately responsible for the conditions that caused it, would be punished swiftly and visibly. As the courtroom began to empty, Walter rose from his seat, buttoned his jacket with the same unhurried precision he brought to every public moment of his life, and allowed himself, just for a second, the smallest, coldest smile anyone who knew him had ever witnessed. He had made his example. He had silenced his board's doubts, satisfied his retail partner, and reasserted exactly the kind of control he believed his father's company and his father's legacy demanded of him. He had no idea what he had just done. He had no idea that the woman gathering her folder of useless incident reports with trembling hands, the woman he would not even glance at one final time on his way out of that courtroom, was the only reason his heart was still beating at all. Renata sat alone in her car in the courthouse parking garage for nearly 40 minutes after the verdict, unable to make herself turn the key. She did not cry where anyone could see her walking past. She waited until she was certain she was alone, until the garage had emptied out around her. And then she let go of everything she had been holding together since the moment those legal papers landed on her doorstep weeks earlier. The kind of crying that comes after years of quiet loyalty has just been used as evidence against you in open court. The damages were immediate and merciless. Langford Freight Solutions' legal team moved to garnish what remained of her modest savings within 2 weeks of the ruling, citing the judgment with the same cold efficiency Walter applied to every business decision he made. Her car was repossessed first, a detail that complicated everything else that followed, since Dallas was not a city built for a woman trying to job hunt without reliable transportation. She fell behind on her mortgage payments the following month. Then the month after that, the Lee and Walters attorneys had warned about during trial slowly tightening around the only stable thing left in her and Caleb's life. Caleb, 14 and sharper than his mother gave him credit for some days, watched her change in ways she tried desperately to hide from him. She answered his questions about money with short, careful sentences that did not quite match the worry etched permanently into the corners of her eyes now. He stopped asking about new cleats for football season without being told no. He started doing his own laundry without being asked, started microwaving his own dinners on nights his mother came home too exhausted to do much beyond sit silently at the kitchen table staring at bills she had no way of paying. Renata never told him about the kidney, about the donation, about the strange, cruel irony sitting underneath everything that had happened to them. She had never told anyone outside her sister, and admitting it now, in the middle of all this loss, would have felt to her like begging for sympathy she had promised herself she would never need. She lost her job 2 weeks after the verdict, though Langford Freight Solutions never framed it as a termination. A company that had just been vindicated in open court, proven innocent of any systemic negligence by a judge's own ruling, had little practical use for the one dispatcher that same judge had just publicly labeled careless. Renata was quietly moved out under a severance package too small to meaningfully help, and a non-disparagement clause too restrictive to challenge, without risking what little remained of her legal standing. She applied to nearly every logistics company within driving distance of Dallas over the following 2 months. Word, she quickly discovered, traveled fast inside an industry as tightly networked as freight dispatch. 3 separate hearing managers brought up the lawsuit unprompted during interviews, asking pointed questions about negligence and accountability before Renata had said a single word about her own qualifications. By early spring, she was working 2 part-time retail shifts just to keep the lights on and the mortgage payments current. A woman who had once kept an entire dispatch floor, running smoothly now folding clothes and restocking shelves in a city that used to know her name in a very different context. Walter Langford, during those same months, barely allowed himself to think of her at all. The retail contract had been secured exactly as promised. The board had watched him handle a public crisis with the kind of decisiveness that quieted every quiet doubt circulating about his leadership. And for a stretch of months, Walter's life continued exactly the way he had always assumed it would, profitable, controlled, entirely on his own terms. The woman he had crushed in court reduced in his mind to a closed chapter he never expected to revisit. That sense of control began quietly unraveling in late spring, during what should have been a routine follow-up appointment with the same nephrologist who had managed his case since the transplant. Dr. Priya Anand reviewed his latest blood work with a stillness that immediately put Walter on edge, the particular kind of careful, measured stillness doctors adopt right before delivering news nobody wants to hear. She explained, gently but directly, that his creatine levels and certain antibody markers had begun trending in a direction that concerned her, subtle enough that an earlier round of testing had missed it entirely, but unmistakable now across 3 consecutive panels. Further testing over the following weeks confirmed what Dr. Annan had begun to suspect. Walter's body had started a slow, partial rejection of the donated kidney, a gradual immune response that had likely been quietly building beneath the surface for months while his numbers still looked, on paper, almost entirely normal. Dr. Anand used careful, clinical language, words like manageable and early intervention and treatable if caught at this stage. But Walter heard only the single, unmistakable thread running underneath all of it. The kidney that had given him 3 additional years of life. The kidney he had never once thought seriously about since the day he woke up from surgery, was failing slowly. And there was no guarantee that a second living donor would ever be found in time, especially not one whose body matched his own as precisely as the first one had. For the first time since that December morning years earlier, Walter found himself thinking, really thinking, about the person whose body had made his recovery possible in the first place. He had assumed, in the careless, transactional way wealthy men often assume most things, that the matter had been fully settled the moment the surgery succeeded. The donor's role concluded the instant his own numbers stabilized. Now, sitting in Dr. Annan's office hearing that his borrowed time might be running out again, Walter Langford wanted answers he had never once thought to ask for 3 years earlier, when asking would have cost him nothing at all. Walter was not a man accustomed to waiting patiently for anything, and the same hospital privacy policies that had once shielded Renata's identity from him now stood directly in the way of the one piece of information he suddenly needed more urgently than almost anything else in his life. He began with Dr. Annan herself, the person who had managed every detail of his transplant from the very beginning. She explained, with the same gentle firmness she had used to deliver his diagnosis, that donor information remained permanently sealed unless both parties had agreed in advance to mutual disclosure, an agreement that had never been made in Renata's case, since neither of them had ever been asked. Walter pressed harder than professional courtesy allowed, reminding Dr. Annan pointedly of exactly how much money his family's charitable foundation had contributed to that hospital's transplant program over the preceding decade, the kind of leverage that had reliably bent smaller obstacles in his favor throughout his entire career. Dr. Annan did not move an inch. Federal privacy law, she reminded him calmly, did not bend for donation history, regardless of how generous a man's checkbook had been in the past. Walter left that meeting angrier than he had been in months, deeply unaccustomed to hearing the word no from anyone employed by an institution his own money had helped build. So he turned, as he so often did when official channels failed to deliver the result he wanted, to something considerably less official. A private investigator named Russell Pike, the same discreet firm Walter's medical concierge service had quietly used years earlier to help coordinate the original donor search, received a simple, narrow assignment. Find out who had donated a kidney to Walter Langford during a specific surgical window in mid-December, 3 years prior, through the sponsored donor drive run out of Langford Freight Solutions' own corporate offices. Pike did not need much time at all. Cross-referencing corporate sponsorship records against the hospital's surgical scheduling logs, then narrowing further against a short list of employees who had taken unpaid medical leave that particular December, brought the search down to 4 plausible names within roughly a week of work. 3 of those 4 employees still worked at the company and were quickly ruled out through brief, casual conversations that gave no indication they had ever undergone major surgery of any kind. The 4th name belonged to someone who no longer appeared anywhere on the current employee roster, someone whose personnel file had been quietly closed out the previous spring under a severance arrangement and a non-disparagement clause. Details that, when Pike dug slightly deeper out of professional thoroughness, connected unmistakably back to a recent, locally publicized lawsuit. Pike's full report landed on Walter's desk on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. Walter read the name typed plainly at the top of the second page once. Then read it again, certain for a moment that his eyes were somehow deceiving him. Renata Coslow, the former dispatcher, the woman from the lawsuit, the one whose negligence he had personally instructed his legal team to make a very public example of less than 6 months earlier, the same woman whose trembling hands on the witness stand he had watched without a flicker of visible reaction. Walter sat alone in his office for a long time after reading that report, the pages spread open across his desk, one hand pressed flat against his own chest, as though he might somehow feel the organ underneath it differently now that he finally understood exactly where it had come from. He thought about the courtroom. He thought about her voice cracking under Gerald Voss's relentless cross-examination. He thought about the small, cold smile he had allowed himself on his way out of that building, satisfied, certain, completely unaware. For the first time in longer than Walter Langford could clearly remember, he had absolutely no idea what to do next, and no attorney, no board member, no amount of money sitting in any account bearing his name was going to be able to tell him. Walter did not call ahead. He did not send an assistant, did not loop in his lawyers, did not draft a careful statement the way he handled everything else in his life. He drove himself, alone, to a small rental house on the outskirts of Dallas, the address Russell Pike had included at the bottom of his report almost as an afterthought. Renata answered the door still in her retail uniform, exhaustion written into every line of her face, and for a moment she simply stared at him, certain she was looking at some kind of mistake. Walter Langford did not belong on her porch. He belonged in courtrooms and boardrooms, and the version of her life she had spent the last several months trying to rebuild without him in it at all. He asked if he could come in. She did not move from the doorway. She asked him in a voice flattened by months of exhaustion rather than anger, what exactly he thought he was owed from her now after everything. Walter said nothing for a long moment, then told her the truth plainly, the way he had never once managed to in that courtroom. He told her about the rejection, the blood work, the doctor's warnings. He told her he knew now who had saved his life 3 years earlier. He told her he was sorry, a word that visibly cost him something to say out loud. Renata's expression did not soften the way he might have expected. She told him quietly that she had given away a piece of her body without ever asking for a name in return, without expecting gratitude, without wanting anything except for someone else to keep breathing. She told him she had never once regretted that decision, not even now. But she told him the man standing on her porch apologizing was not the same man who had looked her dead in the eye in that courtroom and said nothing while his lawyer destroyed her piece by piece. That man had known exactly who she was capable of being. He simply had not cared. Walter stood on that porch in silence, hearing, for the first time, exactly what his own ambition had cost someone who had once given him everything and asked for nothing. Walter Langford did not leave that porch the same man who arrived on it. He drove home in silence, and for the first time in years, he did not go straight into his office. He sat with what Renata had said until well past midnight, turning it over the way he had once turned over contracts and quarterly numbers, except this time there was no clean solution waiting at the end of it. The next morning, Walter did something none of his board members, none of his lawyers, and certainly none of his employees ever expected from him. He called a press conference, not to announce a new contract or defend a decision, but to publicly admit what he had done. He stood in front of cameras and told the city of Dallas the truth about the lawsuit, about the known software glitch his own company had ignored for months, about ordering his legal team to make an example out of a woman who had once saved his life without ever asking his name. He did not soften it. He did not hire someone else to say it for him. Within days, Langford Freight Solutions reversed the judgment, dropping all damages and issuing Renata a settlement large enough to cover everything she had lost and then some, her home, her savings, the dignity she had been stripped of in that courtroom. Walter went further than his lawyers advised him to. He created a permanent position for Renata, not back in dispatch, but as an internal advocate with the authority to investigate exactly the kind of system failures that had nearly ended her life, the way the company had handled it, reporting directly to the board instead of to him. Caleb watched his mother walk back into a building that had once tried to bury her, this time with her name on an office door instead of a layoff notice. Renata never fully forgave Walter, not in the easy, cinematic way people sometimes expect forgiveness to work, but she found something steadier than forgiveness. She found a version of him willing to be accountable in public, and that to her mattered more than an apology ever could have. Walter's transplant held, stabilized by early treatment, and according to his doctor, the kind of stress reduction that came from finally settling something that had clearly been weighing on him long before his blood work ever showed it. He kept Renata's name on his desk after that, not buried in a file, but written on a card he kept where he could see it every day, a small, permanent reminder of exactly what he owed and to whom. Was justice truly served the moment that verdict was overturned, or only once Walter chose, on his own, to become someone worth being saved by? That is for you to decide. If this story moved you even a little, let us know in the comments what you would have done in Renata's position, and whether you believe a man like Walter Langford can really change or simply learns to perform change better. We read every single comment, and I promise you, I will read every single one and respond personally. If you want more real stories about ordinary people who turned out to have extraordinary hearts, make sure you are subscribed, because the next story we have for you might be the most unforgettable one yet.